The story begins in silence. No executioner's axe, no scaffold, no screaming crowd to bear witness. Only the slow hiss of iron plunged into flame and the sickening quiet of a locked chamber inside Berkeley Castle. There, in the damp dark of England's political tomb, a former king lay helpless, face down, restrained not by chains but by betrayal. The official accounts would insist on dignity, speak of illness or natural death. But they lied. Whispers from chroniclers, monks and diplomats tell another tale, one too grotesque for England to admit, yet too perfect in its cruelty to have been invented. A red-hot rod inserted through the rectum, deep into the bowels of the king. Not a wound to the skin, no visible bruising, just the slow sear of internal organs as heat radiated outward, destroying Edward II from within, literally, symbolically, and politically. This method was not chosen for its efficiency. It was chosen for what it meant. It was punishment by metaphor, a violation of the body meant to echo the perceived violations of the state. An act of internal annihilation designed to leave no scar but one, the obliteration of identity. Edward Plantagenet, born to rule, died without a crown, without dignity, without legacy. His death was not announced with royal fanfare but with rumor. His corpse was prepared for viewing, reportedly untouched, serene, undisturbed by trauma. No wound, no explanation, just absence. For years, even centuries, England maintained that he had died of illness, of sorrow, of inevitability. But beneath the official silence pulsed a darker truth. The murder of a king not by sword or axe, but by humiliation so complete it could only be whispered. That is the nature of this story. What makes it horrifying is not just what was done to Edward's body, but why and how and what it said about the world he inhabited. This is not the tale of a tyrant's fall or a martyr's end. It is the forensic study of a man unmade from within, the medical, political, and psychological dismantling of a royal figure whose very existence offended the architecture of medieval power. In Edward's death, pain became message and silence became execution. He was not just killed, he was erased. Edward II was never supposed to be a problem. He was born in 1284 as the fourth son of Edward I, England's Iron Monarch, a warrior king who forged his legacy through conquest, suppression, and legislative force. A king remembered for driving out the Jews, crushing the Welsh, and humiliating the Scots. Edward I was a man of structure, of war, of towering discipline. In contrast, his youngest surviving son grew into a figure who would resist every assumption of what it meant to be a king in medieval Europe. Where his father was granite, Edward II was clay, malleable, inconsistent, emotionally impulsive. In an era where power was displayed through conquest, masculine virtue, and martial presence, Edward offered softness. He took pleasure in manual labor, associated openly with commoners, and formed relationships that disregarded political protocol. More than a failure of policy, Edward II became to his nobles a failure of performance. He disrupted the ritual theater of medieval kingship not through rebellion, but through passivity, affect, and preference. The trouble began with Piers Gaveston. A knight of minor Gascon origin, Gaveston was introduced into Edward's household before his coronation. Their relationship deepened rapidly, provoking jealousy and hostility from the magnates of the realm. Upon becoming king in 1307, Edward immediately recalled Gaveston from exile, showered him with lands, titles, and public affection. Gaveston was named Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family, and granted direct influence over royal administration. To the barons, this was not mere favoritism, it was a constitutional insult. Gaveston dressed extravagantly, mocked the nobility with vulgar nicknames, and wielded authority with none of the lineage that legitimized such power. Rumors spread quickly. Chroniclers describe their bond as unnatural, suspicious, and intimate in ways that transgressed the norms of the time. Whether their relationship was sexual remains debated, but what mattered was perception. In a political world built on symbolic gesture, Edward's closeness to Gaveston transgressed not just etiquette, but ontology. The king was to be a vessel of God's will. Instead, Edward was becoming a private man in a public role, a king who loved too visibly and not the right people. The nobles responded with brutality. In 1312, after years of political wrangling, they captured Gaveston, subjected him to a mock trial, and executed him without royal permission. It was a direct strike against Edward's authority, a message encoded in blood. The king responded with ineffective rage. His military efforts floundered, his credibility evaporated, and the baronial class, long kept in check by his father's iron grip, began to understand that they held the true levers of power. When England faced its most serious external threat, Robert the Bruce of Scotland, Edward faltered. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the English suffered one of their worst defeats in history. The king failed to command, the troops lacked cohesion, and when the moment of decision came, Edward fled the field. It was not simply a military disaster, it was a crisis of image. Kings were not supposed to run, they were supposed to die in armor, sword raised, blessed by clergy, encircled by banners. Edward's retreat was more than strategic, it was a psychological implosion of the English concept of monarchy. In the years that followed, the pattern would repeat itself with devastating precision. New favorites rose, most infamously Hugh Despenser the Younger, each provoking deeper baronial hostility, each reinforcing Edward's dependency and incapacity. The Despensers used their proximity to the king to enrich themselves and destroy their rivals, triggering widespread resentment and regional rebellions. Edward, incapable of restraining them, became their shield and their puppet. It was during this period that the king's relationship with his own wife, Isabella of France, reached its breaking point. Married as a political alliance between England and France, Isabella had endured years of neglect, humiliation, and political sidelining. By the 1320s, she had become a political figure in her own right, and she had learned, unlike Edward, how to wield power. While abroad, negotiating with her brother, King Charles IV of France, Isabella began a relationship with the exiled Baron Roger Mortimer. Together, they organized what no queen consort had ever dared, a full-scale invasion of England to depose her husband. Their success was swift. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England to overwhelming support. The baronial class, long disillusioned with Edward's erratic rule and the Despensers' rapacity, defected almost immediately. The king fled, was captured in Wales, and brought to Kenilworth Castle under guard. There he was forced to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward III. But the deposition was not enough. Edward II's continued existence posed an existential threat to the new regime. He remained an anointed king, and his survival could serve as a rallying point for discontented factions. The problem was not just his body, it was his meaning. As long as Edward lived, the line between legitimate rebellion and regicide remained dangerously thin. To stabilize their rule, Isabella and Mortimer needed him gone. But they also needed him not to be murdered, at least not in a way that looked like murder. What followed was one of the most chilling examples of symbolic political violence in English history. Edward was transferred to Berkeley Castle in early 1327, placed under the custody of men chosen not just for their loyalty, but for their ability to erase. The castle became a theatre of slow disintegration. He was kept in filth, exposed to disease, deprived of warmth and light. The cell where he was housed was allegedly positioned above the cesspit, forcing him to inhale the stench of rot day and night. Food was irregular, companionship was denied, all comforts were stripped. He was not beaten, he was not tortured in the conventional sense. He was left to decay under observation. The goal was not execution, but the natural collapse of the body and will. Yet that too was too slow. Rumors of his continued survival spread. Some barons expressed unease, and so the plan changed. The next phase would be quiet, it would be final, and it would reflect, in its cruel symmetry, the very accusations that had once surrounded the king's private life. The whispers speak of fire and iron, of a weapon heated until glowing, then carefully, silently inserted where it would leave no surface wound. The perfect political murder, one that left no scars, one that made the body its own accomplice in silence. The descent into non-existence was not instantaneous. It began with the quiet unraveling of bodily dignity, the stripping away of royal identity by slow attrition rather than sudden assault. After his deposition, Edward II was escorted to Berkeley Castle, a fortress not known for its military importance, but for its remote and forgotten location, a perfect place to unmake a man far from the eyes of the court. Berkeley was not a prison in the conventional sense. It was a workshop of disappearance, and Edward, once sovereign of England, was no longer a man to be guarded. He was a problem to be solved, a relic to be erased with the silence of engineered obscurity. His guards were carefully chosen, men of loyalty, yes, but also men of cold discipline. Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers, both appointed to the task of not merely securing the former king, but ensuring that he never again became a centre of gravity in England's unstable political atmosphere. Their role was not to kill, it was to reduce. Inside the castle walls, Edward was stripped of all that had once signified power. His robes were removed, his seals confiscated, his letters restricted. Food, when given, was coarse and inconsistent. He was subjected to the passive violence of exposure, the damp cell, the chill stone, the constant odor of rot from the latrines below. It is said that his room was built directly above the castle's cesspit, so that the former king would be surrounded by the filth of others' waste, his nostrils filled with decay. This was not accidental, this was symbolic desecration. A man who once walked beneath banners and heraldry now breathed the stench of excrement as his daily sacrament. It was a message etched into architecture: here is what becomes of kings who forget what kingship is. But this was not enough. Edward endured, he did not die. Months passed, and outside the castle walls, the problem of his existence grew heavier. Though stripped of his crown, Edward remained an anointed monarch. In the eyes of the medieval world, kings were not just rulers, they were sacral figures, blessed with divine oil, vessels of holy authority. Even in defeat, even in disgrace, the body of a king was dangerous, a spark waiting to be rekindled. Foreign powers began to ask questions. France, his wife's homeland, inquired about his health. The papacy expressed interest. Whispers in England suggested plots to rescue him. And more troubling still, his young son, Edward III, though a child, was beginning to attract sympathy. The longer Edward II remained alive, the more fragile Isabella and Mortimer's regime appeared. Their power had been forged by rebellion, but it could not withstand resurrection. And so, somewhere between August and September of 1327, the decision was made. Edward would not be allowed to die. He would be killed. But the act would be so thoroughly buried beneath the skin of history that for centuries scholars would debate whether it had even occurred. What followed is perhaps the most infamous political murder in English memory, not for its spectacle, but for its grotesque precision. Chroniclers from multiple traditions, English, French, monastic, record similar accounts, separated by time and allegiance but united in horror. They describe a small group of men entering Edward's cell under cover of darkness. There is no trial, no reading of sentence. He is restrained, perhaps gagged, perhaps already weak from disease and isolation. Then the device is produced, a metal rod, long and narrow, heated in fire until red with heat. It is inserted rectally, thrust deep into the body until it scorches the internal organs. The choice of method was not accidental. It was not simply a means of death. It was theater, symbolism, and erasure fused into a single act of anatomical cruelty. The murderers chose this form because it mirrored the rumors that had long surrounded Edward's private life, his known intimacy with Piers Gaveston, his indulgence of Hugh Despenser, his perceived failure to embody the martial and masculine virtues expected of a king. The rod burned his entrails, but it also branded his memory. It was a final accusation, written in pain, that turned the internal into the eternal. There were no external wounds. That was the point. The skin remained intact, the face unmarked. When the corpse was displayed, there was nothing to see, no bruises, no bleeding, just stillness, just death. Officials could claim natural causes. The castle guards could swear no violence had occurred. The silence was medical, surgical, state-sanctioned, and the body, now emptied of rebellion, could be buried without spectacle, without protest, and most importantly, without martyrdom. But the story escaped, as stories always do. Within months, monks and messengers were whispering of the method. They described screams that pierced the stone walls, a fire that glowed in the hallway, the stench of something not quite human. Some said the murderers wore masks to avoid recognition. Others claimed they were richly rewarded. None were punished. And the chroniclers, men sworn to truth, to scripture, to confession, repeated the tale with macabre detail, each version adding consistency to the original blasphemy. Whether embellished or exact, the story held power because it explained the inexplicable. It matched the crime to the accused, the punishment to the rumor. This was not death by accident. It was execution by ideology. In the medieval mind, punishment had to fit the crime not in law, but in meaning. Thieves lost hands, traitors lost heads, and kings who loved wrongly, ruled passively, and governed through desire rather than strength. They were unmade from the inside out. This was symbolic inversion. The method mocked his perceived effeminacy. It punished what his enemies claimed he enjoyed. It was the state reaching into the body, past all defenses, to cauterize not just rebellion, but deviance. In this way, the execution became an exorcism. Edward's body was no longer a site of sovereignty. It was a warning. His murder was not simply hidden. It was transformed into metaphor. And yet, in their silence, his killers betrayed themselves. No official record named the act. No court acknowledged the method. But their very denial created the space for myth. Rumor spread faster than decree, and what had been engineered as a discreet elimination became, paradoxically, the most memorable death of any English king. His body was buried, but the image endured of fire, iron, and the obliteration of self through anatomy. The story lingered because it satisfied a truth that official history could not contain, that kingship, once broken, must be destroyed utterly, that failure to perform power was punishable not merely by exile, but by symbolic ruin. Edward II's final moments were not just an execution. They were a choreography of degradation. His body became a manuscript in which the state inscribed its fear, its judgment, and its contempt. And in that act, they created a legend that would haunt English memory forever, not because of its brutality, but because of its precision. He was not stabbed, he was not hanged, he was burned from within, punished by the same system that had once crowned him. His death, though denied, became the most unforgettable. A horror sustained not by fact alone, but by the need to believe that power, once misused, demands not just correction, but total, annihilating retribution. The final act of Edward II's undoing was staged not upon a battlefield, not within the legal frameworks of deposition or trial, but within the darkened bowels of Berkeley Castle, where a king once anointed with sacred oil was turned into a symbol of all that medieval England feared most: softness in place of strength, affection in place of rule, vulnerability in the place of virility. The red-hot poker, if it was indeed used, was no mere instrument of death. It was the mirror in which the state reflected its own disgust, its own anxiety, its own repressed aggression toward a sovereign who had failed to embody the only virtues it permitted a monarch: military competence, visible dominance, and sexual orthodoxy. Edward had violated each of these, not through active betrayal, but through absence. He had not conquered, he had not ruled, and most unforgivably, he had loved men. In a kingdom built upon the theology of divine masculinity that made him more than unfit, it made him unclean. The death he received was not simply meant to silence him, it was meant to rewrite his very flesh as evidence against him. By 1327, Edward II's body was no longer his own. It had become a contested space, a site of meaning. To his captors it represented unresolved danger. To his enemies it was the final obstacle to legitimacy. To his kingdom it was an embarrassment. And to his assassins it was a blank page upon which the new regime could inscribe a final, devastating commentary. This is what happens to kings who do not rule with iron. This is what happens to those who break the unspoken codes of gender and governance. The act of internal burning, if real and all signs suggest it was, offered the perfect combination of secrecy and savagery. It destroyed the body without marring the surface. It sent a message only to those who could decipher it, and it left no public relic to honor. But more than that, it inverted the medieval order of punishment. In most executions, the body was transformed into a site of public instruction, hung, drawn, quartered, heads placed on spikes. But Edward's destruction was private, internal, secretive. His punishment was not intended for the crowd. It was reserved for those in power, the lords, the bishops, the monarchs abroad. It was a message written in flame and inserted into the human core. No king, however consecrated, is beyond correction when he fails to perform the narrative of power. The symbolic irony of the method chosen is inescapable. Edward had been ridiculed for his unmanly affections. He had surrounded himself with male companions, given them titles, wealth, and emotional allegiance. The rumors, often unfounded but always politically useful, painted him as a monarch, ruled by lust rather than law, by desire rather than duty. His enemies exaggerated these rumors because they needed him to be not just a failed king but a corrupt man. That narrative justified the rebellion, it sanctified the deposition, it gave moral cover to the murder. So when the assassins struck, they did so in a way that fused accusation and execution into one act. The red-hot poker was not just a killing tool, it was a theological gesture, a moral punctuation, a perverse exorcism meant to cauterize the past and purify the body politic. It violated Edward in the very way he was accused of violating the natural order. The logic was circular, grotesque, and exact, and it was meant to be. Even the choice to leave no wound was an act of domination. It denied Edward even the dignity of martyrdom. There would be no bloodied relic, no severed head, no sainted legacy. His death was to be an absence, a silence, a void in the historical record. His tomb, ornate but emotionally barren, offered no insight into his suffering. The official narrative, death by grief, by illness, by resignation, was bland by design. It stripped the moment of tension, it erased the horror, and yet it failed. Because the silence was too loud, because the story whispered among monks and murmured in foreign courts was too perfect to be ignored, and once believed, it could not be forgotten. The image of a king screaming in private while the world looked away has lingered for centuries, not because it is proven, but because it is precise, because it fits, because it tells us what medieval England truly feared. Not rebellion, not failure, but softness, love, humanity. What Isabella and Mortimer executed was not just a man. It was a mode of kingship that could not be allowed to stand. Edward's reign had threatened the core myths of royal masculinity. He had made himself legible as human, and in so doing, illegible as monarch. In medieval England, kings were avatars of divine wrath, instruments of justice, fonts of strength. Edward was none of these. He loved too openly, he ruled too weakly, he forgave too easily, and in the end, he suffered too privately. The act of internal destruction was not just a punishment, it was the final sealing of a failed performance. The body had betrayed the crown, the soul had slipped outside the script, and the only remedy was a death so unseen, so unspoken, that it would live forever in the shadows of memory. And yet, it is that memory that survives. The spectacle they tried to hide has become the spectacle history most remembers. No other English monarch has a death so grotesquely specific, so eerily detailed in its supposed silence. That irony is the true climax. Edward II, denied every form of public kingship in life, became one of the most viscerally remembered in death. The fire they hid beneath his body has never stopped burning in historical imagination. It remains a glowing brand on the English monarchy's own conscience, a reminder that power, when stripped of mercy, when terrified of softness, when obsessed with performance, produces not glory but cruelty. Edward II's murder was not about ending a reign. It was about rewriting what it means to rule. And the tool they chose was not the sword or the axe. It was silence, secrecy, and fire, delivered where no eye could witness, but where the soul could still scream. History did not forget Edward II. It misremembered him. It made him a ghost in his own grave, rumored, pitied, mocked, and mythologized. His tomb in Gloucester Cathedral still stands, its effigy regal and composed, a king recumbent in stone. But beneath that stone lies not just a body but a contradiction, a man who ruled as king but died as problem, a monarch whose destruction was carried out with such methodical silence that centuries later scholars debate whether it truly happened. And yet, in that very uncertainty lies the design. To kill someone without leaving a mark is to own not just their body but their story. It is to dominate memory itself. Edward's death was an act of narrative control. The red-hot poker, whether wielded in fact or merely in legend, was never just a method of execution. It was a symbol planted in the mind of posterity. The horror it evokes is not only physical, it is structural. It reveals the machinery of state violence not as an accident of power, but as its natural outcome when dissent takes the form of softness, when affection is viewed as sedition, when failure to perform masculinity becomes grounds for annihilation. The moral theatre of kingship demanded that deviance be punished not only in life but beyond it, not simply through erasure, but through inverted memory, transforming a failed king into a cautionary tale. The very grotesqueness of Edward's end served a function. It reminded those who watched, those who ruled, and those who obeyed, there are deaths worse than execution, and powers more lasting than bloodshed. What remains is not a clean narrative, but a haunting. Edward's legacy is a phantom limb in English history, never fully severed, never fully felt. The line between rumour and reality, cruelty and necessity, justice and sadism remains unresolved. And in that ambiguity lies the true horror. The worst tortures are not always the loudest. the most successful silencing leaves nothing to refute. Edward II, once a failure in life, became immortal in myth. Not because of what he did, but because of what was done to him, and how thoroughly the world tried to pretend it hadn't happened. If you want to hear more of the stories they tried to bury, subscribe. We don't just remember, we reveal.